This isn't a negotiation. It's a notification. The voice was cold-clipped, belonging to a man in a crisp security uniform that seemed too clean for the cavernous concrete garage. He stood over her, a sterile silhouette against the gleam of $1 million supercar. Ava knelt on the floor, her arms wrapped around her son, as if her body alone could shield him from the words. "Please," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "He's just a child. He's all I have. Don't do this." Markham didn't even look at her. His gaze was fixed on some distant point, his expression one of bored indifference. He raised the phone to his lips, his voice dropping into a mask of false civic concern. "Yes, operator. I need to report an endangered child. Yes, I'll hold." He looked down at her, then a flicker of triumph in his cold, empty eyes. "Like I said, procedure." The world narrowed to the sound of Ava's own heart, pounding in her ears, a frantic drumbeat of terror. This was it. This was the moment she would lose him. Not to a monster in the dark, but to a man with a rule book in a place surrounded by a fortune she could never imagine. If you believe a mother's love is stronger than any circumstance, hit the subscribe button, because what happens next will change everything. The lock turned with a sound like a bone snapping. It was a final unforgiving click that separated Ava Johnson's world into a before and an after. Before, there was a small, damp apartment with a leaky faucet and walls thin as paper, but it was theirs. After, there was only the street. The rain didn't just fall, it descended a cold, heavy curtain that washed the city of its color, leaving only shades of gray on gray. Neon signs from skyscrapers bled onto the wet pavement, their bright promises of wealth and success feeling like a personal mockery. Ava pulled the thin collar of her jacket tighter, a useless gesture against the wind that cut through the fabric. Tucked against her chest, bundled in her own oversized coat, was Leo. Her son. Her entire world now a small, feverish weight against her heart. He coughed a dry, rattling sound that seemed to be swallowed by the vast emptiness of the financial district at night. The monolithic buildings of glass and steel stood as silent, indifferent witnesses. They were monuments to a world that had no place for a woman with $3 in her pocket and a sick child in her arms. Just 2 weeks ago, she'd had a job, a future. She was a good graphic designer, talented even. But she had been an easy scapegoat for a project's failure, a convenient name to place on a termination form. Now the word fired was a brand on her soul, making it impossible to find another job, impossible to pay the rent, impossible to keep the small world she had built for Leo from crumbling. "Mama, I'm cold," he whimpered, his voice muffled by the layers of cloth. "I know, baby. I know," she whispered, her own breath misting in the air. "We'll find somewhere warm. Just a little longer." But the shelters were full, every door closed to them. They had walked for hours, it seemed, past lobbies of gold and marble, past restaurants where people laughed behind plate glass, safe and dry. Each scene was a fresh sting of exclusion. They were ghosts haunting a city of feasts. Then she saw it. Not a shelter, not a doorway, but an entrance. A wide, sloping ramp leading down into the belly of one of the tallest towers. It was a parking garage, but unlike any she had ever seen. The sign carved in subtle, elegant letters read, "Thorn Tower, Private Residence and Valet." It was a gateway to another universe. The ramp was steep, but it led underground, away from the wind and the relentless rain. It was a desperate idea, born from the chilling fear that was beginning to seep into her bones. Clutching Leo tighter, Ava slipped down the ramp, her worn sneakers silent on the smooth concrete. The air changed instantly, the scent of rain replaced by the sterile smell of polished concrete, expensive leather, and gasoline. The garage was a cathedral of wealth. Rows of silent, gleaming machines sat under soft, recessed lighting. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, a line of black Rolls-Royces, each one worth more than she could ever hope to earn in a lifetime. The space was vast, quiet, and strangely peaceful. It was also warmer. She found the darkest corner, a space between a concrete support pillar and a car so black it seemed to drink the light around it. A Bugatti, the nameplate whispered. She didn't know what that meant, only that it was long and low and offered a perfect dark space to hide. She gently settled Leo onto the ground, unwrapping her own coat to create a makeshift bed for him on the cold floor. He curled up instantly, his small body seeking the phantom warmth of the fabric. She sat beside him, her back against the cool painted tire of the $1,000,000 car, and pulled her knees to her chest. For a moment, there was a sense of relief so profound, it felt like a physical release. They were out of the rain. They were safe, if only for a few hours. The silence was broken by the sharp, rhythmic click of dress shoes on concrete. Ava's heart seized in her chest. She froze, pulling Leo closer, trying to make them both smaller, invisible. A figure emerged from the shadows of the far wall, a man in a crisp, dark security uniform. He held a long flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp white cone through the dim light. He wasn't patrolling randomly. He was moving with purpose, his steps echoing with an authority that made the air feel thin. This was Markham. His flashlight beam swept across the row of cars glinting off a chrome bumper, a polished hood, and then it stopped landing directly on them. The light was blinding. Ava threw a hand up to shield her eyes, her other arm protectively covering Leo. Markham walked closer. His expression a mask of pure, undiluted contempt. He didn't look at her as a person, but as an infestation. A piece of garbage that had somehow blown into this pristine, sterile world. Well, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Look what we have here. He didn't lower the light. He kept it fixed on her face, pinning her in its glare. This isn't a homeless shelter, sweetheart. This is private property. Ava found her voice, though it trembled slightly. I'm sorry. My son, he's sick. We just needed to get out of the rain for a little while. Markham let out a short, humorless laugh. Your sob story doesn't work on me. I've heard them all. He took another step, his shadow looming over them. He pointed the flashlight at Leo, who stirred, whimpering in his sleep. You think you can just bring your filth in here? Tarnish a place like this? The word, filth, landed like a physical blow. Ava flinched, her entire body tensing. She wanted to scream, to rage at the injustice, but she knew it would only make things worse. Her only priority was Leo. We'll leave, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Just give us a minute. Oh, I'll give you a minute, Markham sneered. A minute before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing. And him, he gestured at Leo with the flashlight. They'll take him to child services. Bet you'll think twice about where you sleep then, won't you? The threat was a blade to her throat. The thought of being separated from Leo, of him being taken away by strangers, was a horror beyond anything she could imagine. Tears she had fought to hold back now burned in her eyes. Please, she begged, the word torn from her. Please don't. Markham seemed to savor her terror. He raised his radio to his lips, his thumb hovering over the button. The small static crackle of the device sounded like a death sentence. Ava squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the end, for the loss of everything that mattered. Then the radio crackled again, this time with a voice. Markham, report. We have a sensor alert on level 3. Possible water leak. Get up here now. He paused, lowering the radio. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He looked down at Ava. His lip curled in disgust. "Your lucky night," he spat. "But don't get comfortable. I'll be back. And when I am, you'd better be gone." He turned and walked away, his footsteps sharp and menacing, leaving them in the dim, echoing silence of the garage. Ava didn't move. She couldn't. She just sat there, her body trembling uncontrollably, listening to the sound of her own ragged breathing and the soft, wheezing breaths of her son. They were still here. They were still together. But the click of Markham's shoes had been replaced by the ticking of a clock, counting down the minutes until he returned. The reprieve wasn't a gift. It was just a delay of the inevitable. Surrounded by unimaginable wealth, she had never felt more destitute, more trapped, more utterly alone. Some debts can only be paid to a stranger. The cold of the concrete floor seeped into Ava's bones, a damp, persistent chill that sleep couldn't erase. But it was the memory of a different kind of cold that kept her truly awake. It was the sterile, air-conditioned cold of a conference room just 2 weeks prior. She could still see the face of her manager, Mr. Jennings, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. He had held up her design proposal, the one she'd poured 60-hour weeks into, and presented it as his own masterpiece. And when the client found a fatal flaw, a flaw Jennings himself had introduced at the last minute against her advice, he hadn't hesitated. He had pointed his finger at her. In front of the entire team, he spoke of incompetence, of a lack of commitment. The words were clinical corporate daggers. Effective immediately, he had said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "We've decided to go in a different direction." Gets fired. It wasn't a shout, but a quiet, clean execution. She had been erased. Her talent, her dedication, her late nights, all of it vanished, sacrificed to protect the ego of a lesser man. The injustice of it was a bitter pill she was still trying to swallow. She hadn't been fired for a mistake. She had been fired for being a threat and for being an easy target. That was the cold that truly lingered. High above the silent garage in a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home, Julian Thorne stared at a wall of screens. Each one displayed a different angle of his domain. The lobby, the elevators, the private helipad on the roof. But his eyes were fixed on camera feed 7B, the corner of the third-level parking garage. He watched the woman, Ava, as she shifted, pulling a threadbare coat tighter around the sleeping child. He saw more than a stranger seeking shelter. He saw a ghost. With a click of his mouse, he minimized the live feed and opened a single scanned photograph on his main monitor. The image was old, the corners soft with time. It showed a young man with a wide, infectious smile, his arm around a beautiful woman. In front of them sat a small boy, no older than 2, with bright, curious eyes. The man was David, his best friend, his brother in all but blood. The memory was as sharp and clear as the city lights outside his window, a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. The rhythmic, agonizing beep of the heart monitor was the only percussion to their final conversation. David's hand, once strong enough to pull Julian from the darkness of his own youthful despair, was now a fragile, paper-thin thing in his grasp. "You have to promise me," Jules David had whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Promise me you'll find them, Elena and Matthew. If anything happens, you find them." Julian had squeezed his friend's hand, his throat tight with unshed tears. "Nothing is going to happen, man. You're going to get through this." But David had shaken his head, a slow, tired motion. No, I'm not. But they have to. She's strong, my Eleanor, but she's alone. She doesn't have family to fall back on. And my boy, my Matty. He had coughed then, a deep wrenching sound that brought nurses rushing in. Before they pulled him away, David had locked eyes with Julian, a lifetime of trust and fear and love passing between them. "Promise me," he'd said again. "I promise," Julian had answered. It was the last thing he ever said to him. David had passed away 3 days later, and in the whirlwind of grief and a chaotic corporate takeover he was navigating, at the time Julian had lost track of Eleanor. She had moved, her number was disconnected, and his perfunctory attempts to find her had failed. The guilt had settled deep within him, a secret past, a silent, corrosive failure that he carried every day. He had built an empire, but he had broken the most important promise he had ever made. Until now, he dragged the live feed from camera 7B next to the old photograph. He zoomed in on the sleeping child's face. The image was grainy, shadowed, but his heart pounded in his chest. The shape of the boy's head, the curve of his cheek. It had to be him. It had been 4 years since David's death. The boy would be 6 now. This child, Leo, looked to be about that age. And the woman, she was tired, worn down by life, but beneath the fear in her eyes, he could see a flicker of the same strength he had once admired in Eleanor. Grief is a powerful lens. It can make you see resemblances where none exist, find patterns in chaos. Julian, a man who built his fortune on cold, hard data, was now making the biggest decision of his life based on a grainy image and a desperate hope. He saw David's son in the face of a stranger's child. He saw Elena's resilience in Ava's quiet dignity. He convinced himself because he needed to. This wasn't just a homeless woman and her child. This was his chance at redemption. This was the universe giving him a second chance to fulfill his vow. He leaned forward, his fingers tracing the outline of Leo's face on the screen. The name was different, but people change their names. Circumstances change people. All that mattered was that he had found them. He had found his responsibility. The boy in the garage was no longer just a child. He was the kid from the photograph. He was David's legacy. He was the secret past Julian had sworn to protect. And he would not fail him again. To be hated and helped by ghosts you cannot see. The sun rose over the city, but its light never reached their dark corner of the garage. For Ava, the new day didn't bring warmth, only a renewed sense of dread. Every distant sound, the hum of an elevator, the squeal of tires from a level above, sent a jolt of panic through her. Markham's parting words, "I'll be back," had echoed in her thoughts all night, a relentless drumbeat of fear. She had barely slept watching over Leo, whose feverish breathing was the only sound in their small concrete world. She had to leave. She knew it. But where would they go? The rain had stopped, but the world outside was just as cold and unforgiving. She was just gathering the courage to wake Leo when the footsteps returned. Not the hurried, menacing pace of Markham, but a slow, deliberate stroll. It was him, and he wasn't alone. Another guard walked beside him, and Markham was talking, his voice purposefully loud, carrying easily in the cavernous space. "Management wants this level cleared for a deep clean today," he announced, though he was looking directly at Ava. "Have to get all the trash out. You know how it is. Vermin find a dark corner, and they start to breed." The other guard shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking toward Ava and Leo before quickly looking away. He said nothing. Ava's stomach coiled into a tight, bitter knot. She was the trash. She was the vermin. She began to gently shake Leo awake, her movements frantic. "Leo, baby, we have to go. Wake up!" But Markham was enjoying himself. He stopped a few feet from them. "Oh, look what we have here. Still haven't moved." He pointed to the floor. "Routine pressure wash on this level. Starts in 5 minutes. If you're still here, you're going to get soaked." Then again he added with a smirk, "A bath might do you some good." Panic flared in Ava's chest. A pressure wash. The thought of that cold, powerful jet of water hitting Leo was unthinkable. "We're leaving," she said, her voice shaking, as she tried to pull a drowsy Leo to his feet. High above, Julian watched the scene unfold on his monitor, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his marble desk. He saw the smug cruelty on Markham's face, the fear in Ava's eyes, the way she shielded her son with her body. He saw the other guards' complicit silence. He had seen this kind of casual dehumanization before in boardrooms and back alleys. It was the quiet violence of power, the assumption that some people were simply worth less than others. His hand shot to the phone on his desk, his fingers dialing the direct line to the garage's security hub. He didn't need to disguise his voice now. The time for subtlety was over. "This is Thorne," he said, his voice low and cold as ice. The name alone was enough. The guard at the other end of the line audibly straightened. "The occupants in parking section 7B are under my personal observation. They are not to be disturbed, approached, or spoken to by any member of your staff. Any employee who violates this directive will be terminated immediately. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir. Understood, Mr. Thorne." Down in the garage, Markham's radio crackled to life. "Markham, stand down." "Repeat. Stand down from 7B. Return to the main desk. Directive from the top floor." Markham froze, the smirk wiped clean from his face. He stared at his radio, then at Ava, his expression a mixture of confusion and raw fury. The top floor. Who on the top floor would care about this? He opened his mouth to argue, but the voice on the radio was firm. "Acknowledge Markham." He clipped the radio back to his belt, his jaw tight. He shot Ava one last look, a look that promised this wasn't over before, turning on his heel and stalking away, his authority stripped from him in a single humiliating command. Ava stood trembling, Leo clinging to her leg. She didn't understand what had just happened, but the immediate threat had vanished. She sank back to the floor, her legs too weak to stand, and held her son, rocking him gently. Julian watched them on the screen, his anger slowly giving way to a deep, aching sadness. Stopping the abuse wasn't enough. He had to do more. He called his personal assistant. "Carla," he said, his voice back to its usual calm command. "I need something arranged. A delivery to the third-level garage section, 7B. Leave it by the main support pillar. I want hot soup from the Savoy grill, 2 thermoses, sandwiches, a carton of warm milk, and blankets, cashmere. Find the softest ones you can. And no, there's no name on the delivery. Just leave it and walk away. Make sure no one sees you." An hour later, Ava noticed it. A large, unmarked canvas bag sitting near the pillar. Her first instinct was fear. Was it a trap from Markham? But her curiosity and the faint, delicious smell of food drew her closer. Hesitantly, she unzipped the bag. Inside, nestled in soft wrapping, were 2 thermoses, a stack of perfectly wrapped sandwiches, and 2 of the thickest, softest blankets she had ever touched. They were a deep, calming grey and felt like a cloud in her hands. She opened one of the thermoses. The rich aroma of tomato soup filled the air. It was hot, real hot food. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were not from fear or humiliation. They were from a profound, shattering sense of gratitude. Someone had seen them. Someone somewhere had chosen to be kind. She woke Leo gently. "Look, baby. Look what someone left for us." Leo's eyes widened at the sight of the food. They ate in silence, the warm soup chasing the chill from their bodies. It was the best meal they'd had in weeks. Afterwards, wrapped in the impossible softness of the new blanket, Leo felt a little of his energy return. He looked up at the sleek, curved underbelly of the Bugatti above them. "Mama," he said, his voice serious, "does this car have a TV I want to watch cartoons?" For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ava let out a real, genuine laugh. It was a watery sound, fragile, but it was real. She hugged him tight, burying her face in his hair. "I don't think so, my little superhero," she whispered, her heart aching with a love so fierce it almost hurt. "This car is just for going very fast, but we've got this warm blanket. That's better than a TV, right?" He nodded, snuggling deeper into the cashmere. He didn't know what cashmere was. He only knew it was warm and his mother was with him, and for now that was enough. Ava held him looking out into the dim, silent garage. She was still a target. She was still terrified. But she was no longer completely alone. An anonymous ghost was watching over them, and in the darkest corner of her world, a tiny flicker of hope had been lit. Dignity is the one thing they can't steal, so they try to make you give it away. For 2 days, a fragile peace settled over their corner of the garage. The anonymous gifts of food had stopped, but the memory of them and the impossible softness of the cashmere blankets had created a small shield of hope around Ava. She allowed herself to believe that perhaps they had been forgotten, that they could remain in this strange, concrete purgatory unnoticed. It was a foolish hope, and she knew it. Men like Markham didn't forget. They waited. He came on the 3rd day, not with threats, but with a mask of strained professionalism that was somehow more unnerving. He wasn't alone this time. He was accompanied by another older guard, a man whose weary eyes suggested he had seen it all and wanted no part of any of it. Markham began, his voice slick with false courtesy. "Apologies for the intrusion, but we have a situation. A piece of company property has gone missing from this level. A calibrated lug wrench for the McLaren. A very specific, very expensive tool." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. His gaze didn't meet hers. Instead, it drifted pointedly to the small, worn backpack that held all of their worldly possessions. Ava's blood ran cold. She knew with sickening certainty where this was going. "I haven't seen anything," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm sure you haven't," Markham replied smoothly. "But procedure is procedure. Given that you and your son are the only unauthorized individuals on this level, we have to conduct a search of your belongings. For insurance purposes, you understand." The older guard shifted his feet. "Markham, maybe we should just—" "It's procedure." Frank Markham cut him off, his voice hardening. He turned back to Ava. "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. Please empty your bag." It was the most profound humiliation she had ever endured. Worse than the firing, worse than the threats. With Markham and Frank watching, she was forced to unpack her life onto a dirty rag Markham had kicked over for the purpose. Out came a half-empty bottle of water, a Ziploc bag with 3 crackers, a small travel-sized tube of toothpaste, her wallet which held her ID, $3 in cash, and a faded school picture of Leo, and Leo's most prized possessions, a small box of broken crayons and a dog-eared notebook filled with his drawings. Markham put on a pair of latex gloves, a theatrical gesture of disgust, and picked through her things as if they were contaminated waste. He opened her wallet, thumbing through its contents. He shook out the notebook, letting the crayon drawings flutter to the ground. Leo, who had been sleeping, woke up and sat straight, his eyes wide with fear. "Mama, is that man looking for my drawings?" he asked, his voice trembling. "No, baby, it's okay." Ava soothed her heart, breaking. She reached for a drawing that had landed near her foot, a wobbly portrait of a superhero with a big L on his chest. Markham saw the motion. "Don't touch anything," he snapped. He found nothing, of course. There was nothing to find. His feigned disappointment was an insult. "Well, it seems it's not here. You can pack your things back up." He stripped off the gloves and dropped them on top of her belongings before turning to leave. "But we'll be keeping a closer eye on you." Frank, make a note. A full inventory of their items. As they walked away, Ava knelt on the cold floor, gathering her scattered life. She picked up the drawing of Leo's superhero, her hands shaking with a rage so deep it left no room for tears. This wasn't about a missing tool. This was a violation. A deliberate act designed to strip her of the last shreds of her dignity, to make her feel so worthless that she would leave on her own. In his penthouse, Julian Thorne watched the entire scene on the 4K monitor, his face a granite mask. He saw the gloves. He saw the drawings scattered on the filthy floor. He heard the child's frightened question. He had built an empire on logic and calculated risk, but what he felt now was something primal. It was the ice-cold fury of a man who had made a promise to a dying friend and was now watching as that friend's family was being degraded, humiliated by an arrogant fool in a security uniform. This had gone far enough. The time for anonymous aid was over. It was time to show power. He picked up his secure phone and accessed a piece of software his own company had designed, a voice modulator that could make his voice deeper, colder, completely untraceable. He dialed Markham's personal security cell. Markham answered on the first ring, his voice still smug. "Security, Markham." The voice that answered was not one he recognized. It was deep resonant and carried an authority that seemed to suck the air out of the room. "Markham. This is a communication from the executive office of Mr. Thorne." Markham's posture changed instantly. He stood up straighter. "Yes, sir. Your performance is being evaluated in real time." The voice continued, each word a perfectly enunciated threat. "The occupants of parking section 7B are under Mr. Thorne's special observation. Your current line of inquiry is not only inappropriate, it is a direct violation of a confidential corporate directive. You will cease all interaction with them, effective immediately. You will not speak to them. You will not approach them. You will not so much as look in their direction." "Is there any part of that you fail to comprehend?" Markham was pale, sweating. "No, sir. I didn't know. No one told me." "You were not told because you do not have the clearance to know," the voice cut in, leaving no room for argument. "Consider this your only warning. Your next interaction will be with Human Resources and our legal department. We are watching." The line went dead. Markham stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. Special observation. Personal interest to Mr. Thorne. His mind raced, trying to piece it together. Who was that woman? A relative, a mistress. Someone from Thorne's secret past. It didn't make sense. But the threat was real. The power behind that voice was absolute. His fear, however, quickly curdled into something else. Resentment. He had been publicly dressed down his authority, undermined all for a homeless woman and her kid. A dangerous curiosity began to grow in the back of his mind. He would obey for now. But he would also watch, and he would find out who she was. Down below, Ava finished packing her bag. She didn't know what had happened, only that Markham had retreated, as if struck by lightning. She held Leo close, comforting his fears while her own mind was a storm of confusion. The faceless kindness had been a mystery. But this was different. This was the unmistakable feeling of a powerful, invisible shield being lowered around them, and she had no idea if it was there to protect her or to trap her. There are weapons crueler than threats. They come with badges and clipboards. The quiet that followed the phone call was a fragile, brittle thing. For a full day, Markham was a ghost. Ava didn't see him, but she felt him. She felt his presence in the unblinking red light of the security cameras, a constant silent surveillance that made her skin crawl. The anonymous protection she had received was real, but it had also painted a target on her back. She was no longer just an inconvenience to Markham. She was a mystery he was determined to solve, a personal insult to his authority. And a man like Markham could not let an insult stand. He found his weapon not in a threat, but in a rule book. In the sterile quiet of his small security office, surrounded by monitors displaying the silent life of the building, he scrolled through the corporate policy manual. He wasn't looking for a way to harass her anymore. He was looking for a way to remove her that was clean, official, and untouchable. He found it on page 87, under section 4.1c, Duty to Report. The policy stated that any employee who became aware of an at-risk or endangered minor on company property was legally obligated to report the situation to the appropriate city authorities. It was a perfect, elegant solution. He wouldn't be the aggressor. He would be the concerned citizen, the responsible employee. He wouldn't be breaking the top-floor directive to leave her alone. He would be fulfilling his legal duty. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. He picked up the phone and dialed. They arrived 2 hours later. Not with the loud wail of sirens, but with a quiet official presence that was infinitely more terrifying. A police cruiser pulled up to the garage entrance, followed by a nondescript sedan. A uniformed police officer emerged, his hand resting casually on his belt, his expression one of weary duty. From the sedan came a woman in a plain grey suit, carrying a leather-bound clipboard. She was Ms. Albright from the city's Child and Family Services Division. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing, her face a mask of professional neutrality that was colder than any open hostility. Markham met them at the entrance, his demeanor transformed. He was no longer the smug bully, but the picture of a concerned, responsible manager. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said, his voice low and serious. "The situation is over here. I was worried for the child's safety." He led them to Ava's corner. When Ava saw them approaching, the uniform, the clipboard, her blood turned to ice. This was it. This was the fear that had been her constant companion, the nightmare she had been running from. This was how she lost him. "Ma'am, my name is Ms. Albright," the woman said, her voice calm and even. She knelt down, not looking at Ava, but at Leo, who had retreated behind his mother's legs. "Hello there," she said softly to him. "What's your name?" Leo just stared, his thumb finding its way into his mouth. Ms. Albright looked up at Ava, her professional gaze taking in everything: the concrete floor, the single worn backpack, the cashmere blankets that looked so strangely out of place. "Ma'am, we received a report of a child living in this garage. Can you tell me what's going on?" Ava tried to speak, but her throat was tight with panic. We were just staying for a little while. We're between places. He's safe. I'm his mother. He's safe with me." "Where do you sleep?" Miss Albright asked her, pen poised over her clipboard. "Right here," Ava whispered, gesturing to the blankets on the floor. "And for meals, restroom facilities." The questions were gentle, clinical, but each one was a hammer blow, shattering Ava's fragile defense. She had no good answers. There were no good answers. "I take care of him," Ava insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "I would never let anything happen to him. Please, we were just about to leave." Ms. Albright gave her a look of practiced pity. "I understand this is a difficult situation for you, ma'am, and I can see that you love your son very much." She stood up, her face resolute. "But this is not a home. It is not a safe or sanitary environment for a child to be living in. I cannot, in good conscience, leave him here." The word struck Ava with the force of a physical blow. "No," she breathed. "No, you can't. You can't take him." The police officer stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, no one is taking anyone yet. We're just going to escort you to the City Services Center. They have resources, warm beds, food. We'll get this all sorted out." But Ava heard the word he didn't say. Placement. She had heard stories from other women at the shelters. Temporary placement, a clean, bureaucratic term for tearing a child from his mother's arms. That was the real threat. Markham hadn't just called the police. He had weaponized the system itself against her. "Please," Ava begged, turning to Markham, who stood watching with a look of cold vindication. "Tell them it's a mistake." Markham simply shrugged. "I did my duty. The rest is up to them." There was no appeal. There was no one to call. Her anonymous protector, the one who had given her food and blankets, was silent. The shield had vanished. Ms. Albright gently took Leo by the hand. "It's okay, sweetie. We're going to go somewhere warm." Leo looked back at his mother, his face a crumpled mask of confusion and fear. "Mama," that single word broke her. A sob escaped Ava's throat as the officer gently but firmly guided her toward the exit. She was forced to walk away from their small corner, past the gleaming, indifferent supercars, her hand clutching Leo's as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. She had been fired. She had been homeless. She had been humiliated. But this was the bottom. This was the moment she lost everything. As they stepped out of the garage and into the harsh light of the city, she felt the last flicker of hope extinguish, leaving only a cold, dark void. The man who owned the shadows was about to step into the light. The walk across the garage was the longest of Ava's life. Each step on the cold concrete was a step toward an unknown, terrifying future. The officer's hand rested lightly on her elbow, a gesture that was meant to be professional, but felt like a brand. Leo, clutching her hand, was unnervingly silent, his small face pale with a fear he was too young to understand. Markham trailed behind them, a smug, victorious shadow. They were almost at the ramp, almost at the point of no return, when a soft musical chime echoed through the cavernous space. It was a sound so out of place in the grim silence that everyone paused. It was the sound of the private executive elevator, the one set apart from the main bank of lifts, the one that descended directly from the penthouse. Heads turned as the polished steel doors slid open with a silent, expensive hiss. A man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a uniform or a power suit. He was dressed in a simple, dark cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, his presence radiating a stillness that instantly commanded the attention of the entire room. He was tall, his features sharp, his eyes a deep, piercing gray that seemed to take in the entire scene in a single sweeping glance. Markham froze, his jaw going slack. The officer tensed his training, kicking in at the arrival of an unknown variable. Ms. Albright, the CPS worker, adjusted her clipboard, her professional composure faltering for the first time. The man walked toward them, his steps unhurried, yet filled with an undeniable purpose. He didn't look at Markham. He didn't even glance at the police officer. His gaze went straight to Ms. Albright, and then softened as it rested on Leo. "Officer." "Ms. Albright," he said, his voice calm and measured, yet it cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "There appears to have been a grave misunderstanding. My name is Julian Thorne." The name landed with physical weight. The officer's hand instinctively moved away from his belt. Ms. Albright's eyes widened in recognition. Markham looked as though he had been struck by lightning. This was the name whispered in the halls, the reclusive billionaire who owned this tower and half the block it stood on. The man no one ever saw. Ms. Johnson and her son are not trespassers. Julian continued his tone, leaving no room for debate. They are my personal guests. They are here under my explicit and direct protection. The report that was filed was not only a mistake, it was a malicious act made in direct violation of my orders. The officer cleared his throat. Sir, we had a report of an endangered minor. The only danger this child was in, Julian interrupted his voice, becoming lethally quiet, was from the employee who has been tormenting his mother for days. As for their welfare, I will be personally seeing to it. Your services, while appreciated, will no longer be required. He held their gaze, and in that moment it was clear who held all the power in the room. He was not asking, he was dismissing them. Miss Albright was the first to recover. Of course, Mr. Thorne. If you're vouching for their safety, then our work here is done. She gave a curt nod, gathered her things, and retreated to her car with a haste that betrayed her professional demeanor. The police officer followed suit, mumbling an apology as he backed away. Now only 4 people remained in the echoing silence: Julian Ava, a terrified Leo, and a pale, trembling Markham. Julian finally turned his full attention to his security manager. The quiet stillness was gone, replaced by a gaze so cold it could have frozen steel. Mr. Thorne, Sir Markham stammered, his voice cracking. I was just following policy section 4.1c. I thought the child was in danger. I didn't know they were your guests. You were not following policy, Markham. Julian said each word, precise and devastating. You were indulging in a personal campaign of cruelty. You were told in no uncertain terms that they were under my observation and were not to be disturbed. You chose to defy that order. You chose to use a rule book as a weapon to terrorize a woman and her child. He took a step closer. You are a liability. You are a disgrace. And you have no place in this organization. Julian turned to the other guard, Frank, who had been watching from a distance, looking deeply ashamed. Frank Julian commanded, Escort Mr. Markham to his office. He will gather his personal belongings. His security clearance and all building access are revoked effective immediately. He is to be off these premises in 10 minutes. Markham's face crumpled. No. Please, Mr. Thorne, I have a family, a mortgage. It was just a mistake. This Julian said, gesturing toward Ava. And Leo was not a mistake. It was a choice, and choices have consequences. As Frank led the now sobbing Markham away, a profound silence fell once more. The battle was over. Ava stood frozen, unable to process the sheer, stunning reversal of her fate. She was still clutching Leo's hand, her knuckles white. Julian approached them, and the cold mask of authority dissolved, replaced by something softer, something infinitely more human. He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with Leo. The boy, who had been hiding behind his mother, peeked out at the strange man. I'm sorry you were scared, Julian said to him, his voice gentle. It's over now. You're safe. Then he looked up at Ava. Her face was tear-streaked, her eyes wide, with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a gratitude so overwhelming it left her breathless. For the first time, she saw him, not as a savior or a billionaire, but just as a man, one whose eyes held a deep, familiar sadness. Miss Johnson, he said, his voice quiet, but clear. My name is Julian Thorne. I sincerely apologize for what you have been forced to endure in my building. He stood up slowly. I know you have questions, and I promise I will answer them. But first, let's get you and your son out of this cold garage and to a place that is warm and safe and dignified. He gestured back toward the gleaming steel doors of his private elevator, which had remained open, spilling a soft, warm light onto the concrete floor. "Please," he said, "allow me." Ava looked from the defeated figure of Markham, being led away to the powerful, quiet man, offering her a kindness she couldn't comprehend. She looked down at Leo, who was staring at Julian, with a child's unfiltered curiosity, his fear beginning to fade. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Ava made her choice. She took one hesitant step, and then another, leading her son out of the shadows and toward the light. A promise kept for the wrong person is a promise broken twice. The apartment wasn't a penthouse. It wasn't a palace of glass and steel overlooking the city. It was something far better. It was a home. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen that bathed in the morning sun, and a living room with a deep, soft couch. To Ava, it was the grandest place on earth. For the first week, she found herself simply touching things: the smooth, cool surface of the kitchen counter, the solid wood of the front door, the impossibly soft sheets on Leo's bed. These were the textures of safety, the architecture of a life she thought she had lost forever. Julian had been true to his word, and then some. He had not only provided the apartment, but he had given her a job. Not charity, but a real position at his company's philanthropic arm, the Thorn Foundation. She was back to doing what she loved: design. She spent her days creating brochures and websites for community outreach programs, her skills not just used, but valued. For the first time in a long time, she felt like Ava Johnson, again, not just a survivor. The change in Leo was even more profound. The constant rattling cough that had been the soundtrack to their fear had faded, replaced by the sound of his laughter, echoing in their small, warm apartment. With access to proper medication and a stable home, the fever was gone, and the light had returned to his eyes. He spent hours at the small desk Julian had set up for him, his new crayons and sketchbooks spread out, creating worlds filled with colorful heroes and vanquished monsters. Julian visited them twice that first week, his presence a quiet, awkward anchor in their new reality. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, who could move markets with a single phone call, but in the presence of a 6-year-old boy, he was hopelessly out of his depth. He brought Leo a complex-looking action figure, a hero from a movie he'd clearly never seen. He held it up, studying it with the same intensity he might give a financial report. So Julian said, his voice serious, "As I understand it, this character's primary ability is projecting laser beams from his ocular cavities. Correct?" Leo, who was sitting on the floor, looked up at him with the pure, unfiltered exasperation that only a child can muster. "No, Mr. Thorne," he said, shaking his head. "That's Star Smasher. He can talk to the stars, and he has a force field." "You don't know anything." Ava, watching from the kitchen doorway, had to stifle a laugh. Julian actually looked embarrassed. He sat on the floor next to Leo, the expensive fabric of his trousers wrinkling on the rug. "You're right," he said to the boy. "I don't. Could you teach me?" And Leo did. Ava watched as the reclusive billionaire and her 6-year-old son spent the next hour on the floor, deep in the mythology of the Galactic Guardians. She saw a side of Julian. She never would have imagined a man capable of a gentle, patient kindness that felt more real than any grand gesture. A warmth spread through her chest, a complicated, fragile feeling she didn't dare put a name to. It was in the 3rd week, when everything finally felt settled and real, that the foundation of their new world cracked. Julian, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, decided it was time to make good on the financial part of his promise to David. He would establish an educational trust fund for the boy he knew as Leo, ensuring his future was secure forever. It was a simple matter his lawyers had told him. All he needed was a copy of the boy's birth certificate. He was in his office, the city lights beginning to sparkle below, when the email from Ava arrived. The subject line read, "Leo's certificate, as requested." He smiled. He was finally doing it. He was honoring David. He was making things right. He opened the attached file. The document loaded on his main screen, a scanned copy of an official certificate. His eyes went straight to the name. Leo Marcus Johnson. Johnson Ava's last name. That made sense. Then he scanned down. Mother Ava Marie Johnson. His eyes moved to the next line. Father Robert Miller. Julian stared at the screen. Robert Miller. Not David. Not David Sterling. His first thought was that she had sent the wrong file. A simple mistake. He was about to compose a polite email, asking her to check again, when a cold, sickening dread began to pool in his stomach. He minimized the document and pulled up the old scanned photo of David's family. The smiling man, the beautiful woman, the small boy. Elena and Matthew Sterling. He dragged the image next to a photo he had taken of Leo just last week, on his phone. In it, Leo was laughing his head, thrown back a milk mustache on his upper lip. For weeks, Julian had seen David in that laugh. He had seen Elena in Ava's strength. He had willed the resemblance to be true. But now, with the certainty of the names on the certificate burning in his mind, he saw it all with horrifying clarity. The boy in the old photograph had a slightly different curve to his smile. His eyes, though bright, were a different shape than Leo's. They weren't the same child. He had stared at this photo 1,000 times over the years, memorizing every detail of the family he had failed. How could he have been so blind? The room began to feel small, the air thick and unbreathable. He stood up, pacing the length of his office. It couldn't be. A coincidence. It had to be a coincidence of impossible odds. A woman with the same story, a child of the same age, in his building at this exact time. But the names were the undeniable, brutal truth. Ava Johnson was not Elena Sterling. And Leo was not Matthew. The sense of peace that had filled him for weeks evaporated, replaced by a guilt so profound it felt like a physical weight on his chest. He hadn't kept his promise. He hadn't saved his friend's son. He had saved a stranger. And all this time, while he was feeling redeemed, the real Matthew David's son was still out there, somewhere, lost, maybe hungry, maybe cold. He collapsed back into his chair, staring at the two images on his screen. The laughing, vibrant boy he had come to care for, and the faded, ghost-like image of the boy he had sworn an oath to protect. He had built a new life for one, while completely failing the other. The promise wasn't kept. It had been broken all over again. A good man's burden is not in the promises he breaks, but in the ones he still has to keep. For a long time, Julian didn't move. He sat in the high-backed leather chair in his silent, darkened office, the city lights a distant, indifferent galaxy outside his window. On the screen before him, two images remained, side by side, the faded photograph of David's family, a ghost from a past he had failed, and the crisp, clear birth certificate of a boy named Leo, a stranger. The revelation had not come like a sudden crash, but like the slow, sickening creep of water filling a sealed room. There was no air left. The sense of peace he had felt, the quiet redemption he had allowed himself to enjoy, had all been an illusion, built on the foundation of a tragic mistake. He had kept his promise to the wrong person, which meant he hadn't kept it at all. His first impulse was a wave of cold, sharp anger. Anger at himself for his blindness, for letting his own guilt and desperate need for absolution cloud his judgment. He, a man who could dissect a corporate balance sheet in minutes, who could spot a flaw in a multi-million-dollar deal from a mile away, had failed at the one task that truly mattered. He had let his grief write a story that wasn't true. What was he supposed to do now? The options felt like a series of betrayals. He could tell Ava the truth. He could say the words aloud. "I helped you because I thought you were someone else." The thought made him physically ill. It would shatter the fragile dignity he had worked so hard to restore for her. It would taint every act of kindness, turning it from a gesture of compassion into a clerical error. It would be an act of unimaginable cruelty. He could stop helping them. He could quietly withdraw, letting them continue their new life while he focused on his original mission. But that felt just as impossible. His connection to Ava and Leo was no longer about a debt to David. It was real. He had seen the relief in Ava's eyes when she talked about her work at the foundation. He had heard the sound of Leo's easy, healthy laughter. To abandon them now would be a fresh betrayal. A new promise broken. He was trapped, caught between a duty to the dead and a newfound loyalty to the living. He leaned his head back, rubbing his tired eyes, feeling the immense weight of his wealth and power as a burden, not a tool. What good was all of it if it couldn't fix this? His gaze drifted to the side of his monitor. Taped there was a piece of paper, a child's drawing in bright, waxy crayon. It was the picture Leo had given him a few days ago. A tall stick figure man with a crooked smile held an umbrella over a smaller stick figure. Below it, in shaky block letters, Leo had written, "Mr. J, the Superhero." Julian stared at the drawing. In its simple lines, there was no past, no broken promises, no mistaken identities. There was only the pure, uncomplicated gratitude of a child who had been shown kindness. It wasn't about David or Eleanor or Matthew. It was about Leo. It was about a little boy who had been cold and was now warm, who had been scared and was now safe. The bond he had formed with this child, with his resilient mother, was real. It had grown from a mistake, yes, but its roots were now deep and true. And in that moment, he found his answer. It was not a choice between one family and the other. It was a decision to be the man who could be responsible for both. A few days later, he was at Ava's apartment. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He and Leo were on the floor, surrounded by drawing paper. Julian was attempting to sketch a lion, but it looked more like a worried potato with a mane. Leo, a far superior artist, was already finishing a vibrant, multicolored spaceship. Ava came in from the kitchen, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. She paused, taking in the scene, a soft smile playing on her lips. She looked at Julian's clumsy drawing, and her smile widened. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone light and teasing, "I think you should probably stick to your corporate acquisitions. The art department seems to be my son's territory." Julian looked down at his sad-looking lion and let out a genuine laugh, a sound that felt surprisingly natural in this small, warm apartment. "You're right," he admitted, shaking his head. "Perhaps I should hire Leo as my new creative director." The moment was simple, easy, and filled with a sense of belonging that felt more real than anything in his penthouse. This was family. Not the one he had lost, or the one he was still searching for, but one he had stumbled into by accident. And he would not let it go. That evening, back in his office, Julian made a decision. He pulled up a secure file on his computer, one containing the contact information for a man named Elias Vance, a private investigator who was the best and most discreet in the business. Julian had used him once before for a sensitive corporate matter. He picked up the phone. "Vance," he said when the call was answered. "It's Thorne. I have a job for you." He sent an encrypted file across the line. "I'm sending you a photograph and 2 names. Elena and Matthew Sterling, the mother and son of a deceased friend. They were last known to be in this city 4 years ago. I have no other information." He paused, his voice steady, resolute. "Find them. Spare no expense. Be discreet. This is a matter of the utmost personal importance." He ended the call and leaned back in his chair. He looked at his monitor where he had once again placed 2 images side by side. On the left, the faded photo of the family he had sworn to protect. On the right, the bright crayon drawing of a superhero holding an umbrella. The weight on his shoulders was immense, heavier than his entire empire. It was the weight of 2 promises, one made in grief to a ghost, the other made in silence to a little boy who drew him as a hero, and he, Julian Thorne, would find a way to keep them both. What happens when a beautiful act of kindness is built on a profound mistake? Does it lessen the good that was done, or does it create a new, more complicated truth? For Julian, the journey to fulfill one promise led him to a family he never sought, but now cannot imagine abandoning. His heart now holds 2 loyalties, one to the ghost of a promise made, and one to a little boy who sees him as a hero in the present. This isn't a story about a perfect, easy ending. It's about a man shouldering the immense weight of 2 duties, understanding that sometimes redemption is not a destination, but a new, more difficult road to walk. Have you ever faced a choice with no easy answer? If this story resonated with that part of your heart, we'd be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. For more stories that explore the quiet, complex corners of the human spirit, consider sharing this video and subscribing to our channel. Until next time.